Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Dill. Absolute chaos all Saturday in the landscape of college football. That's reflected in the new AP Top 25. Dill, I agree with a decent amount of the rankings. Certainly have my disagreements as well. Want to get into, we're 6 weeks through the season. Let's start weeding out some real contenders and then talking about some pretenders as well in these rankings. Fired up to get into it. Before we do, and as always, I think most importantly, let it fly in the comment section. I certainly know I have my problems with these rankings still. I know you certainly have some problems. I'm sure many of y'all do as well. Let it fly in the comment section. Talk about some teams, overrated teams that are underrated. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Though without further ado, let's talk about some of these overrated teams. I'll give you the T-box first. Who you got?
And this is a bit of a hot one, but I think Georgia's a little bit high for my liking, and it's not very high. I think they're probably around 8. I would throw those 3 teams immediately behind them, probably ahead of Georgia, because I'm totally ready to just look past some of the things Georgia's had go on.
Yeah,
Played
serious flaws.
Kentucky, played that game against Alabama. I know they came back in it, but they got run off the field in that first half, and I'm not sure Alabama just lost to Vandy. So I don't think I'm ready to excuse these things. And I think inherently my real issue is Carson Beck just doesn't look like himself. He doesn't look comfortable with these weapons that he has at his disposal. And I think the lack of having Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey is really starting to show.
That was by far the biggest question is okay, you can't replace Brock and Ladd, but can you kind of simulate the production they had? And we kind of thought they could, right? Dylan Bell, Colby Young, London Humphrey through the transfer portal. We thought there was just enough there to kind of replace in mass losing guys like Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey. It is very evident that Carson Beck is nowhere near as comfortable as he was last year without those two pass catchers. I think secondly, Dale, this offensive line is not what we're used to seeing from this Georgia group. They're not running the football. They're not all that good in pass protection either. We're used to seeing Georgia be one of the best offensive line in the country every single year. I don't think they're that special along the lines of scrimmage. Now, I get they've been dealing with some injuries, right? Tate Ratledge going down, Jared Wilson. But still, Georgia's been able to deal with some injuries in the past in terms of depth on the offensive line. They don't seem to be dealing with those injuries as well as they have in the past. Georgia, again, I'm not going to bang the table for them being underrated. We have some big time concerns about Georgia that you're not used to talking about around this Georgia team. I'll give you one. Feel strongly about it. Iowa State. And you can kind of talk about this with the Big 12. I'm just kind of out on the Big 12. I think there's a lot of chaos in that conference. And when you see the Big 12 play other teams out of conference, they just ain't that good. And we got Iowa State, we got BYU, Utah, Kansas State, all in these rankings, and say, I have question marks about every single one of them. Quite frankly, I think Utah's probably the best when Cam Rising's healthy, but I got massive question marks about if Cam Rising's ever going to play football ever again for Utah. Iowa State, what's their most impressive win on the season? Like a 1-point win against Iowa that can't really throw a vertical pass.
I don't see how we can be building houses off that. And it really does feel like that's what they're doing.
And we're building them because they're 11th in the country right now.
And I look at the roster. It's not Notre Dame. It's not LSU. It's not Texas A&M. It's not Missouri. I mean, you got to use a little bit of eyeball test, a little bit of resume. Yeah, the resume is decent, but decent's kind of generous because, again, I think Iowa's terrible.
And I also I think the thing that we're hanging on to with Iowa State is they haven't had that game. They haven't had that game where it's you kind of scratch your head like a lot of these other teams. But I look at the ceiling of Iowa State and say, just beating teams that you should be beating in the Big 12, that does make me feel good about the ceiling. You talk about Iowa State's best football versus Notre Dame or LSU's best football or Texas A&M's best football. I don't really think it's that close. And Dill, I think you look at Utah and Kansas State, if we were to stick on this Big 12 conversation, they at least have some personnel and some aspects about their ceiling as a team that make me a little bit more confident. Cam Rising, a Utah with Cam Rising, I think can be very dangerous. You look at Kansas State and say, if you get Avery Johnson to put it together with DJ Giddens and guys like Dylan Edwards, there's something there. I look at Iowa State and say, what scares you about this Iowa State team? They ain't much. And I think you could say the exact same thing for BYU as well, who has an impressive win against Kansas State that, and Kansas State just kind of lost their mind in that football game. You play that game 10 times. I'm not sure BYU's winning all 10 of them. Let's get to another overrated. I'm getting my overrated and underrated confused. Dill, another underrated team or overrated team that you got in the AP Top 25.
I think it's got to be Indiana. In Indiana, just again, similar to
You're gonna
Iowa
get some
State.
heat, brother.
I don't know that they've played anyone who's like remotely good enough to like give me a litmus test because I look at the roster similar. I mean, even probably more so than Iowa State. Like they just haven't had enough time to put that roster in place. I mean, they weren't good with Tom Allen, so obviously they weren't. The coverage
Yeah,
weren't
well, the
exactly
team's
full.
barely new though. Like that team's insanely new. It's a
I
brand new
know, but
Indiana
like
team.
I just don't think you can build a team that quickly and not have like a ton of big dogs come in. I mean, you've seen some teams do that, but like USC had Caleb Williams come in. You've seen some teams do it, but they've had some real stars come. I look, Indiana doesn't really have that. I don't really know how they've been doing it. They have been doing it, so kudos to them. But I look like, would you be really comfortable them playing Missouri or in Illinois or Nebraska? I don't know that I'd be comfortable taking
Oh,
even neutral site Indiana.
we're gonna get that football game, Indiana Nebraska, in 2 weeks, and that's gonna teach us a lot about that Indiana team. Because I'm kind of with you. Like they've looked the part, very similar to Iowa State. Like, hey, you're looking the part, you're doing what you should, but you're doing what you should against like UCLA, Northwestern. Like those are some of the worst teams that we see at the Power Four level. Look, I think Indiana deserves to be in the top 25 because I think they have at least looked the part, but I got some massive question marks about how legit this Indiana team is. And I got fed. Big Ten power rankings. The Indiana fans were all on me for sleeping on Indiana, and they just keep winning. So the Indiana fans are beating me to the ground right now. We'll see if that lasts going into December. I'm going to go with another under or overrated team here, and I'm going to go with Michigan, Dale. It
I,
pains me.
I think
Like it pains me, but you look at Michigan and say our most impressive win was at home against USC, where you had to rely on like a late 60-yard touchdown to kind of set up a scoring drive there. Um, you don't have
you
quarterback
can't
play.
when you play quarterback the way Michigan's playing quarterback, and they've tried three separate guys. Like
Yeah,
I was holding on to the ship, but it's about time for me to jump off. I just can't believe I can't get into it when they're playing quarterback the way they're playing it. And they're having quarterbacks who again like have their moments in certain spots,
yeah.
but when it becomes important for a quarterback to play well, they're melting. I mean, all three of them have had their moments. They're just like, oh my goodness, like you need them to make a play, and they're just not doing it. And also like the defense has been good. I don't want to like, but it hasn't been like totally stifling in the way it needs to be when you're dealing with this quarterback play.
Yeah, and I think lastly, I just don't think the offensive line's all that good either. Like I say we, I'm a Michigan fan. We're both Michigan fans. Hurts us to say this. Still, in the beginning of the season, the offensive line was a little underwhelming, and what we were telling ourselves was at least, hey, it's a new offensive line. Give them some time to gel. It'll be okay. Well, we're through the first half of the season. The offensive line hasn't really put it together yet, and it's gotten a little bit better, but it certainly isn't the Michigan offensive line that we're used to seeing over the last couple of years. So you combine lack of quarterback play, not a ton of weapons on the outside of Colson Loveland, and just not being able to run the football as consistently as we might have thought we were going to. It's hard to believe in this Michigan team. Any more teams that you want to shout out and call pretenders before we move into our teams that we believe are kind of our sleeper teams that are underrated?
I don't really think I'd call them a pretender, but I don't think LSU is the third team.
It's the one I had in my notes too.
I mean, I look at that defense, they just don't have the guys. I think I like what Blake Baker is doing. I like the direction they're moving, if you will, trying to be a little bit more aggressive, trying to like not play that really soft bend don't break kind of defense,
Yeah.
but they just don't have the guys to do it. They're down Harold Perkins now. I mean, their offense is good, but it's not good
Well,
enough to
you
match.
look at Blake Baker and all the success he had at Missouri. It was like, hey, we're going to bring some heat. We're going to leave our defensive backs on islands. That's what Blake Baker's trying to do at LSU. You just don't have the defensive back. You had multiple NFL guys at Missouri. You don't have those guys at LSU. I'm kind of with you. Like, I think 2 to 3 years down the road, I think Blake Baker's going to get this LSU team moving in the right direction. But as we sit right now, he didn't really do enough in the transfer portal to do what Blake Baker wants to do on defense. And then you look at LSU in general and say you had a dogfight against South Carolina that Ole Miss just beat pretty handily on the road. you look at the loss against USC. USC all of a sudden is not a top 25 team, just lost to Minnesota and Michigan. And so I'm looking at LSU and saying, like, how real is this LSU team? They don't really have those marquee wins. You didn't look that good in the first half against UCLA, who really stinks. Yeah, I think LSU top 15 team that they haven't looked at. And I'll shout out another SEC team, and I know you're going to fight me on this one. Missouri at 21.
Crazy.
You scoff at me, but like what?
I do stuff.
Okay, we'll leave it to the listeners here. Like, what do we think about Missouri? They slept walk through the month of September. Didn't look all that. They went to Vandy might be good, so maybe I won't hold that overtime win against Missouri as much as I used to. Boston College just lost to Virginia, who I don't think is a very good team. And then the first real test you go on the road to College Station and you get pantsed. And so it's like, hey, the Missouri fans know I was a believer in Missouri heading into the 2024 season. And quite frankly, there's still aspects of this football team that I believe in. I think if they just got off to a better start in the first quarter, maybe that's a different football game. I'm not saying you win it, but it might not be as lopsided as it was. But you haven't looked apart.
But that's where we get into the idea, like, is it all based on resume or do you have to include some eyeball tests? Well, it's all based on resume. What do we put Indiana as like the number one team? Because
the eyeball test tells me Missouri ain't that good either, though.
But the eyeball test of who's on that football team tells me they're excellent. So I think, again, have they played good football this year? Definitely not. They've looked terrible for the most part. But that's still a loaded roster. They still have one of the better quarterbacks in the country for my money. I am getting a little concerned about the left side of their offensive line. They're playing really terribly, and that's stunning. Like Marcus Bryant and the kid from Oklahoma, they need
Green. And I would even say Brady Cook doesn't even look that good. So it's like
that is a process. I think their left side of the offensive line is just not helping them enough right now. Brady Cook's not playing incredible, but I think he's doing enough. I think their left side of the offensive line is probably the one area where I'm looking like, I don't know if that's like fixable. Yeah. I think there's a lot of parts of this team that, I think like they can just get smoother and they're still good enough. But that is the one part that I'm starting to get a little concerned with.
Yeah, and that was the thing was like, why were we both so high on Missouri? Was like, hey, we think they can block up some of the best front sevens you see in the SEC. They didn't really do it against Texas A&M. So there are some big question marks about Missouri. Right, let's get some more positive vibes going. Let's talk about some teams that are underrated, Dill. I'll give you the T-box first. Who are the people sleeping on in this top 25?
Well, I think Texas A&M's being slept on. I think they're not very far off from Ole Miss, Clemson, Texas. Those are probably my next three.
Yeah.
I think I'd probably deem it. Frankly, I think 1 through 8, I think I'd keep right in that order. And I think they're all, I don't think there's interchangeable or as differentiated, if you will. I think that a 1 through 8 is pretty close. I think that next group is probably Texas A&M, Ole Miss, Clemson, and Notre Dame. I think
the parity, we probably should have noted this at the top, but the parity of college football is elite this year. Like, if you're just a college football fan, and so if you're a Georgia fan or Alabama fan, you're just walking through most of your games, like maybe not so much. But if you're just a college football fan that enjoys the chaos, like I a little bit do, like this is the year for you. Because like there's not a lot of teams where you're walking in and say, yeah, chalk that one up for them. Maybe we know what's going to happen. So I think the parity is really interesting. And I'm also I think I agree with you. When we do our top 25 tiers, that might be kind of the tier. Like, I'm not like going to bang the table. I think the top 8's good. I think you have Ole Miss kind of on the outside looking in with the opportunity to move up, beating LSU this weekend. Dill, Texas A&M, I agree with. Like, they run that game back against Notre Dame. I would love to see a rematch there. Clemson. I think people watched that Clemson-Georgia game, just took Clemson up, crumpled them in the ball, put them in the trash can, said, all right, not a team this year to monitor.
Still no offense.
But the last couple of games, now granted, it has been against defenses that we think are electric, right? NC State, not the defense we thought. Florida State, certainly not the team we thought. That being said, they are explosive. And that is something that Clemson sorely missed last year. They're a top 10 in the country in terms of yards per pass attempt. We know they have a top 10 caliber defense, and we're starting to see that. If this Clemson offense can maintain that explosive nature, kind of similar to the conversation we have about Penn State, I think this Clemson team's dangerous, man.
No, I don't know that I would call Clemson underrated right now. I
Yeah.
think like they can be really dangerous.
They caught up. They had Clemson down there like 20 for a while, and we were kind of 10s. I'm good with 10. I'm happy.
Yeah, 10 I'm comfortable with too. You know who else might be slightly underrated is Oklahoma. I know their
Oh,
offensive line's really bad, but they play really good defense. I do think while Michael Hawkins, I don't like he doesn't make them a contender, if you will, but like I don't think these other teams just blow them off the ball on the line of scrimmage. They're not good compared to teams like Tennessee or Clemson or Penn State. That's definitely true. But I think their offensive line's good enough to not like get dog walked, if you will, by those some of those teams in front of them, like Iowa State, BYU,
the
Utah.
thing
Like
is, like they
Utah
didn't
would
look
probably be a
they
problem
didn't
for
even look that good against like Houston and Tulane though. And that's what concerned me. Now, what I will say though,
them. Defense, so awesome.
the yeah, defense top 10 unit in the country, no, 100%. What I will say though is that Oklahoma leaning into Michael Hawkins, a guy that can kind of neutralize a pass rush, has that escapability. You can move the pocket with him, read option type stuff. That might help take some pressure off this Oklahoma offensive line. So that's certainly a team to watch. And I'm just going to give a quick shout out before we close this one out, Dill. Then I'm at SMU Mustangs. They made the switch at quarterback, which
Jennings is a problem, I think now. Like that offense
yes,
with him instead of
cut
Preston.
Louisville up. And I think Louisville's defense is not horrible, and they cut them up. Rhett Lashley, I think, is a really good coach. Their defense is not that bad. And man, like Kevin Jennings, they're leaning into him, and they've built an offense around Kevin Jennings. I don't know what I think. Rhett Lashley is so much smarter than me. I don't know what made him stick with Preston Stone as much as he did. You run that game against BYU back. Very confident SMU wins that game, Dill. SMU with Kevin Jennings in an ACC where it's just utter chaos outside of Miami and Clemson at the top. Watch out for SMU making a little bit of a run. That's where we'll close it out. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.